Imagine a skyline pierced by 4,000 temples, the crowning achievement of a golden age that unified a kingdom. Join us as we explore the spectacular rise of the Bagan Empire and the perfect storm of tyranny and Mongol warfare that brought it crashing down. Near the end of the 13th century, specifically around 1293, the Venetian adventurer Marco Polo found himself traversing Southeast Asia in the territory we now know as Myanmar or Burma. By this time, Polo had dedicated the last 2 decades to exploring the Asian continent, embarking on incredible journeys along the historic Silk Road. Recently, he had entered the service of Kublai Khan, the Mongol Emperor of China. The emperor was so impressed by this foreign guest that he appointed Polo as an ambassador, sending him on a mission through the lush, mountainous borderlands connecting southwestern China and Myanmar. Welcome to Mythic Index, a sanctuary for lost legends and forgotten timelines. Here, we peel back the layers of history to reveal the myths that shaped our world, from the fragments of the forgotten past to the vastness of the night sky. If you wish to ensure you can always find your way back to this archive, please subscribe now. Polo trekked through these jungle hills, navigating thick bamboo forests and shady groves before descending into a broad river valley teeming with wildlife. Departing from the province of Cardandan, the path drops steeply for 2.5 days through uninhabited lands. Eventually, travelers arrive at a wide, open plain. If you continue south from there, heading toward the Indian border, you will find the city of Mein. This leg of the trip takes 15 days, crossing a largely empty region dominated by forests filled with rhinos, elephants, and other wild beasts, with absolutely no signs of human settlements. The area was packed with animals, including majestic wild oxen, stags, fallow deer, and an abundance of elephants. However, after traveling for more than 2 weeks, Marco Polo finally discovered a massive city. Even after all the wonders he had witnessed globally, this place amazed him with its sheer scale and grandeur. Over 4,000 golden temples pierced the afternoon sky, their spires rising above the flat basin of the river valley. After the aforementioned 15-day journey, you arrive at Mein, the magnificent capital of the kingdom. The locals, who spoke a unique language of their own, were described as idolaters. Legend held that a wealthy and powerful king had once reigned over this land. The city Polo referred to as Mein had clearly fallen on hard times. Houses everywhere were abandoned, and the temples were crumbling from neglect and disuse. The streets likely bore the scars of war, filled with starving and displaced refugees, yet the towering golden shrines still stood tall above this misery, serving as proof of the city's former glory. Among all these structures, 2 giant temples were especially notable. As the old king approached death, he commanded that 2 marble pyramids be built at his burial site, one at the head and one at the foot. These towers were 10 paces tall, bulked accordingly, and each was topped with a sphere. One of these pyramids was plated with gold an inch thick, completely hiding the stone beneath, while the other was covered in an equally thick layer of silver. Small gold and silver bells hung around the spheres, chiming whenever the wind blew to create a truly splendid object. Years later, Polo would return to Italy only to get caught on the losing side of a war between the rival city-states of Venice and Genoa, landing him in a Genoese prison. He shared his cell with a writer named Rustichello de Pisa, who was fascinated by Polo's travel stories. As they waited for the war to end, the pair collaborated to organize Polo's memories, writing them down with vivid detail and what scholars today consider a surprisingly high level of accuracy. Working alongside Rustichello, Marco Polo became the first outsider to write a description of this empire. Before we drift deep into the ancient past, take a second to tap the like button. Think of it as placing a bookmark in history, helping others find this quiet corner of the internet. He described a metropolis situated at the very core of an imperial power that we now call Bagan. For hundreds of years, this entity unified the territories of Myanmar, presiding over an explosion of artistic and architectural achievement that produced one of the most impressive collections of sacred structures the world has ever witnessed. The Bagan Empire thrived and endured, yet its golden era vanished abruptly. In the blink of an eye, the population abandoned the site, leaving their magnificent temples to slowly crumble into ruins. The saga of medieval Myanmar's Bagan Empire remains one of history's most vibrant tales of survival. This kingdom emerged in the central Irrawaddy River Valley, raising a series of monuments remarkable enough to outlast the centuries. To understand this place, one must look at how the people lived and examine the catalysts behind the empire's sudden, total collapse. Looking at the map today, modern Myanmar reigns as Southeast Asia's most extensive continuous landmass. Its total area rivals the size of Texas and is almost triple the size of the United Kingdom. To the west, the nation shares a border with India, while China lies to the east. The landscape stretches out amidst several major mountain chains: the Arakan, the Chin, the Pegu, and the Shan Yoma. These ranges resemble bony spines running vertically from the north to the south of the country. Between these rugged peaks, waters like the Chindwan, Shweli, Mali, and Enmai flow freely. A great number of these currents originate within the glacial ice of the Himalayas in Upper Burma. They rush down through steep mountain gorges until they converge into the most massive waterway of them all, a wide, curving path known as the mighty Irrawaddy. The title Irrawaddy comes from the Sanskrit word Irrawaddy. In Hindu myth, this refers to the god Indra's loyal steed, a fabled white elephant possessing 7 trunks and 4 tusks. Given the river's majesty, it is easy to understand why it earned such a legendary designation. Winding through Burma's dry zone, the Irrawaddy travels over 2,000 kilometers, passing sandy isles, scrublands, and forests of palm. It ranks among the widest rivers in Asia. During the monsoon season, the waters expand dramatically, stretching nearly a kilometer from bank to bank at certain points. Because these inundations are so extreme, the locals have adapted their architecture over thousands of years. Along the riverbanks, homes are constructed on elevated bamboo stilts, allowing the rising floodwaters to flow harmlessly underneath. As the river nears the conclusion of its voyage, it fans out into a sprawling delta. Here, amidst a network of wandering streams, marshes, and mangrove forests, the water finally spills into the Southern Ocean. The middle section of this river's path cuts through an arid region dubbed Myanmar's dry zone, named for its scarcity of annual rain. A vast basin is formed here, ringed on 3 sides by mountains that absorb the bulk of the moisture. These peaks act like a massive barrier, holding back the clouds like a wall. However, the rain drops in the highlands instead, and that water eventually cascades down through the majestic Irrawaddy River. Consequently, the dry zone actually maintains a steady water supply, provided you remain near the riverbanks. Ever since humans first stepped foot in Myanmar, they have flocked to this waterway to construct settlements, cultivate their rice, and build their lives. Archaeological evidence suggests the earliest cultures arrived here roughly around 11,000 BC. By about 1500 BC, the local population was already smelting copper into bronze, growing rice, and domesticating pigs and chickens, making them some of the first people globally to raise these animals for food. Then, around 500 BC, the region began working with iron. Throughout history, these rivers have also served as superhighways. The locals have always constructed watercraft, ranging from simple rafts fashioned from the light, durable Burmese bamboo found along creek banks and lower slopes, to more sophisticated barges crafted from teak. Teak wood is unique because it holds a substantial amount of natural oil, rendering it incredibly water-resistant. This timber is so plentiful in Burma that it has been utilized for massive structures, including bridges that have stood for almost 2 centuries. A prime example is the U Bain Bridge, which stretches over a kilometer across Tongthaman Lake, supported by over 1,000 teak pillars driven into the lake bed. Residents here even create floating agricultural gardens that rise and fall with the water levels, turning the lake's surface into fertile farmland for hundreds of years. Traveling southward was as simple as letting a boat drift with the flow, but because the dominant winds push from south to north, sailing against the current was equally feasible, making two-way traffic along the river remarkably easy. The Irrawaddy was so central to the region's concept of existence that locals rarely described the country using north or south, but rather used the words Anya for upstream and Akai for downstream. One traditional Burmese poet captures the arrival of summer within the Irrawaddy Valley landscape. He depicts the hot season rising in rebellion against the cold through a pattern of contrasts, bringing cloudy skies and hot winds. It is summer. Tree leaves turn yellow and drop to reveal new growth. Stems might twist or break, yet the tama trees put forth fresh sprouts, soft green like the eggs of a parrot. Meanwhile, in the summer heat, trees in the foothills thirst while tazin flowers climb the tabai trees, releasing their fragrance to mix with the drifting air. As the sun sets, crow pheasants coo, and the call of the cuckoo drifts in from afar. Occasionally, thunder beats across the expanse of heaven like lambara and dainty drums. The poet laments, thinking of the pouring of water on the Badhai tree and missing an absent companion in the golden palace of victory, feeling full of mournfulness. Similar to many Southeast Asian tongues, the Burmese language utilizes different registers depending on how polite or formal one needs to be, and the land itself bears different titles based on the register employed. In everyday conversation, Bama is the most common name for the country and its people, whereas Myanmar is the grander, more poetic designation. Both titles have coexisted for centuries. During the era of British colonization, the administration adopted the informal Burma, which was the name British traders and sailors first heard being used. However, in 1989, the ruling military dictatorship officially switched the title to the grander Myanmar. Due to this complex backstory, the naming issue remains controversial in modern Myanmar, but here I will follow the lead of the majority of Burmese people and use both names interchangeably as the context fits. This geographical setting, the country's dry zone, ringed by mountains and fed by the grand aquatic highway of the Irrawaddy, is the stage where the story of the Bagan Empire plays out. For most of this region's history, whoever controlled the dry zone held power over the rest of the country, and naturally, it was a territory drenched in the blood of conflict. We rely on two major sources to understand events in Myanmar during the medieval period. The first consists of stone inscriptions found on temples and other structures, carved by kings to celebrate their deeds. The second source is known as the Chronicles of Burma. These chronicles represent a diverse collection of documents penned by monks and scholars over the ages using different materials. Some were written on paper crafted from the Siamese rough bush tree or paper mulberry, glued into long sheets and folded like an accordion, while others were inscribed on palm leaves or even carved into stone tablets. The earliest surviving chronicle dates back to the 13th century Bagan era. The so-called Maha Yazawin, or Great Chronicle, was finished several centuries later in 1724. Nearly 100 years after that, the Yazawin Thit, or New Chronicle, appeared, attempting to reconcile contradictions between the chronicles and the stone inscriptions. As its author noted in his introduction, there are chronicles written by ancient scholars, but certain matters within them do not accord with the inscriptions. Since kings funded these documents and supervised their production, they function as instruments of official propaganda, often filled with exaggeration. As we begin to unravel these lost timelines, leave a comment with the name of the ancient civilization that fascinates you the most. Let's see which era calls to us tonight. These historical records often drift into the realm of mythology and poetic license, particularly when describing the earliest eras of Burmese history. The texts contain wild exaggerations regarding military strength, often claiming that battles were fought by tens of millions of soldiers. Furthermore, the narrative is frequently populated by supernatural entities like demons, ghouls, ghosts, ogres, and sorcerers, alongside various characters from traditional folklore. However, beneath this fantastical veneer, the chronicles, when cross-referenced with official inscriptions, actually maintain a surprisingly accurate record of dates and major events, while also safeguarding the cultural memory of the people. In 1829, Burma's King Bajidao commissioned a panel of learned scholars to compile a definitive history of the realm's monarchs. He assembled this team in the shimmering front wing of his royal residence, a building famously called the Glass Palace, and ordered them to begin their work. The king of the law, noticing that previous historical records were filled with contradictions and repetitions, decided to intervene. Believing that the history of the kings should be a standardized record rather than a collection of conflicting falsehoods, he gathered his monks and ministers in that gem-encrusted front chamber, a space worthy of the highest nobility, and ordered the purification of the texts. They compared various chronicles with inscriptions, using reason and traditional texts to determine the truth. The resulting document, dense with footnotes and side stories, became known as the Glass Palace Chronicle. Although it is a complex and winding text, it provides a remarkable window into the mindset of the ancient people of Bagan and how they viewed the birth of their empire. The true origins of the first Burmese speakers remain shrouded in mystery. While the chronicles insist on a royal lineage stretching back to the 2nd century, modern archaeologists and historians view this as highly improbable. A more credible theory suggests that their history began in the early 9th century with a powerful kingdom known as Nanchao. This dominant power controlled the mountainous regions to the east, located in what is now the high-altitude Yunnan province of western China. For a long time, the Nanchao rulers had coveted the fertile river valley of the Irrawaddy. The pivotal moment arrived in the year 832. It was a tumultuous time across the globe. The Byzantine Empire, the surviving eastern half of the Roman Empire, was struggling for survival against emboldened Arab empires driven by the new faith of Islam. In the southern Mayan lowlands of Mexico, Yucatek, the final king of the majestic city of Capan, was commissioning a monument that would never be completed. His civilization was crumbling under the weight of drought and war, forcing his people to abandon the city. Meanwhile, in present-day France, King Pepin I of Aquitaine and his brother Louis the German were leading a revolt against their father, the Frankish Emperor Louis the Pious, son of Charlemagne. Amidst this global chaos, the armies of Nanchao descended from the mountains of southern China to conquer the lands of Burma. During this era, the dry zone surrounding the Irrawaddy River was inhabited by a society we now call the Paiyu. We don't actually know what they called themselves, but they appear to have spoken a Sino-Tibetan language and resided in a loose federation of 5 city-states within the valley. Their culture was heavily shaped by trade with India, having adopted Buddhism, Indian architectural forms, and political concepts centuries earlier, while basing their writing on the Indian Brahmi script. A Chinese text from the 9th century, titled the Manchu or Book of Southern Barbarians, preserves descriptions of this land and its people. It describes a journey south of Yangchang City, past the Tang Empire's borders, through phoenix blue jungles into vast clearings with massive rivers. The text notes that the people lived in multi-story houses without defensive city walls. It describes locals who sometimes painted their teeth and wore untreated cloth with rattan belts, while wrapping their topknots in red silk and letting the rest of their hair hang decoratively. The account also mentions peacocks nesting in the trees and elephants as common as water buffalo, used by the locals to plow fields, while their dung was burned for fuel. The Nanchao forces navigated narrow, forest-choked mountain passes to launch a series of devastating raids on these lowlands, seizing both treasure and captives. Records state that in the 10th year of the Zhenyuan era, Nanchao forces attacked. Specifically, on the 21st day of the 12th month of the 3rd year of the Xiantong era, between 2,000 and 3,000 troops gathered at the cliffs of the Suli River. Ancient sources confirm that the Nanchao invaders deported thousands of the Paiyu farmers from this lush valley, marching them away into slavery. Included in the Nanchao ranks was a unit of cavalry warriors known as the Min, a small ethnic group from the high plateaus who spoke an early form of the Burmese language. These warriors, however, harbored ambitions of independence. Once they experienced the freedom of the Irrawaddy Valley, they had no intention of returning to Nanchao. The arid plains of Burma were ecologically similar to their rocky northern plateaus, and with the native population decimated by raids, the land was open for settlement. The Min defected from the Nanchao kingdom. choosing to settle in this new territory where they would eventually establish their own kingdom. Some historians argue that Burmese speakers were already present in the valley as part of the Pale people, unrelated to the Nanchao military campaigns. However, as is common with this early period, we are faced with a haze of uncertainty and contradiction. The truth likely involves a combination of both theories. To draw a parallel, during this same period on the other side of the world, Norse seafarers were landing on the coasts of eastern England. Arriving as a mix of raiders, settlers, and refugees, these Norsemen would eventually topple the Saxon kingdoms over the following century. In doing so, they imprinted a distinct Norse influence on the English people and language. It is quite possible that the Burmese arrival in the Irrawaddy Valley occurred under similarly complex conditions, resulting in a hybrid culture formed with the existing inhabitants. While much remains obscured by the fog of history, we can say with relative confidence that around the year 849, merely 17 years after the recorded Nanchao raids, the Mien constructed a walled fortress on the eastern bank of the Irrawaddy River. This site would eventually be known to the world as Bagan. The location chosen for Bagan was heavily influenced by the surrounding geography. Built seemingly upon the ruins of an older Paiute settlement, the city sat on a significant bend in the winding Irrawaddy River. This position provided easy access to water and placed the settlement in the center of what would become Myanmar's most fertile agricultural region for the next 5 centuries. This fertility was due in part to the violent geological past of the area. About 50 kilometers southeast of the city stood Mount Popa, a massive dormant volcano. Covered in dense forests and bamboo groves, this volcanic cone has served as a center of worship for the Burmese people for centuries. Just southwest of the main mountain rises Tong Kalat, or Pedestal Hill, a dramatic, sheer-sided volcanic plug towering over 650 meters above sea level, famously topped today by a Buddhist monastery that overlooks the forest. Mount Popa has long been considered the dwelling place of the Nats, powerful spirits whose worship has coexisted in a complex relationship with Buddhism throughout Burmese history. However, this majestic mountain did more than just capture the spiritual imagination of the people. It played a key role in their survival. Volcanic ash is rich in essential elements like potassium, magnesium, and iron, minerals vital for plant growth. As the volcanic rock and ash weathered, these nutrients leached into the earth. Combined with the abundant water supply and the river's silty deposits, this created incredibly productive soil. Consequently, the farmers of Bagan could achieve 2 bountiful rice harvests every year, alongside other crops such as millet, cucumbers, sesamum, and pulses. On this chosen site, the Mien constructed a high, thick brick wall designed according to the principles of numerology and Buddhist cosmology. The perimeter was punctured by 12 gates symbolizing the 12 signs of the zodiac, featuring 4 primary gates facing the cardinal directions: north, south, east, and west. The actual walled section was relatively small, covering just over 1 square kilometer, and housed only the royal palaces and administrative headquarters. Beyond these fortifications, a vast city built of bamboo and teak soon expanded, though these organic materials have long since vanished from the archaeological record. By the middle of the 10th century, a king reigned in Bagan, though specific dates and names for these early rulers are scarce. A 9th-century Arab traveler named Suleiman Nadwi documented the formidable military of a Burmese king, noting that he marched to war with roughly 50,000 elephants. He added that the king only campaigned during the winter because the elephants could not endure thirst, and that the army was so vast it required between 10,000 and 15,000 washermen just to clean their clothes. Through the study of inscriptions, we have identified at least 2 kings from the turn of the millennium, Nyongyu Sorahan and Kyong Pjy Min, figures previously thought to be purely legendary. By 1004, records from China's Song dynasty mention an ambassador arriving from the Piu Khan kingdom, likely a reference to Bagan. This diplomatic mission suggests that Bagan was confident enough to seek recognition from the Song Empire, the region's superpower, and assert its presence on the international stage. Still, reliable information on these early monarchs remains sparse and heavily intertwined with myth. The first king of Bagan to emerge clearly from the historical shadows would not appear for another 50 years. Although the kingdom had likely existed for 2 centuries prior, this man is often celebrated as the founder of the Bagan Empire, and is arguably its first truly great monarch, the leader who would elevate the kingdom to its golden age. His name was Anawrahta. Anawrahta's youth was defined by family strife and political instability. His father, King Kunso, had taken the throne of Bagan by force, overthrowing the previous ruler. Like many who seize power through rebellion, Anawrahta's father lived with the constant anxiety that he, too, would be deposed. Anawrahta was raised in the palace alongside 2 older stepbrothers, Kiizo and Sakate. These men were actually the biological sons of the king whom Anawrahta's father had overthrown, but they were adopted and raised as his own. Despite growing up together, Kiizo and Sakate viewed Anawrahta as their inferior, a dynamic that surely embittered the young prince. It was also evident that these brothers harbored dreams of reclaiming the power their adoptive father had stolen from their bloodline. While Anawrahta was still young, his duplicitous stepbrothers hatched a plot to overthrow his aging father, an event recounted in the Glass Palace Chronicle. Upon reaching adulthood, Kiizo and Sakate constructed a beautiful monastery and invited King Kunso to bless it. The king, failing to suspect their motives, accepted the invitation without scrutiny. Once he arrived, Kiizo and Sakate seized him, terrified him with threats, and forcibly ordained him as a monk. They then spread a false rumor throughout the land that the king, seeking spiritual salvation, had voluntarily abdicated to join the monastic order. This palace coup must have scandalized the royal court, and even though takeovers of this nature were relatively common, Burma's historians are unified in their condemnation of it. The Glass Palace Chronicle describes a series of evil omens that accompanied this shocking betrayal. Around the time of the king's fall, a miracle occurred at the Pato Pagoda. In the sky, the Friday star was seen trampling the moon, while the moon itself appeared as a full circle on only the 2nd day of its waxing cycle. The earth shook for 7 days, and the river water actually stood still. Initially, the brother named Kiizo took power as king, but the chronicles recall that his reign ended when he was killed by a hunter who mistook him for a deer. He had constructed a royal viewing box in the marshes of the Chindwan and traveled to the 10 villages of Bangi to hunt. One day, a hunter was lying in wait for famine at a local watering hole. The king arrived at that same spot to wait for deer, and the hunter, unaware that it was the monarch, fired his bow and struck him, killing him instantly. He died at the age of 28. Around the time of his death, it is said that an ogre laughed for a full half-month and threw stones at the palace. Following this unfortunate accident, the other treacherous brother, Sakate, assumed the throne. It is perhaps fair to wonder if this tale of a hunter accidentally killing the king is just a polite cover-up by chroniclers to obscure the fact that the new king had his brother Kiizo assassinated. Throughout all this upheaval and betrayal, the young Anawrahta seems to have just kept his head down. He was permitted to retain his royal status at court and live with his mother. In return, he served the 2 kings who had overthrown his father and stolen the throne that should have been his. However, when Anawrahta turned 30, King Sakate pushed things too far. In court, he referred to Anawrahta using the word Niithanongmi, a compound term translating roughly to brother-son. Confused by this title, Anawrahta went to the monastery where his father lived in exile to ask for its meaning. To the bitter old former king, the implication was obvious. Sakate intended to marry Anawrahta's mother. Anawrahta repeated the phrase to his father, King Kyingbiu, who replied, "Because he wishes to take thy mother, thus he speaks." Anawrahta became exceedingly angry and begged for the horse, weapons, and gear that the deity Sakra had once given his father. His father handed over the Arindama lance, the Thilawantha sword, the ruby ring, and the ruby hairpin. It is difficult to determine if Anawrahta was truly driven by his mother's honor, or if he had been plotting this all along and simply found a convenient excuse. Regardless, Anawrahta rose in rebellion against his stepbrother. He fled to the holy volcano, Mount Popa, to marshal his forces, gathering lords and chieftains who were tired of the brothers' treacherous antics. From there, he marched on the capital of Bagan. The Glass Palace Chronicle records exactly what happened next. Once he had mustered his army, he advanced toward Bagan and sent a message to his brother asking, "Will you give up the throne or will you do battle?" Upon hearing his younger brother's challenge, Saket was incredibly wrathful and answered, "His mother's milk is yet wet upon his lips, and he says he will fight me. Let all my ministers look on. I will fight him man to man on horseback." When Anawrahta heard his brother's response, he was glad. When the appointed day arrived, he took the lance and sword his father had given him, mounted the demon horse, and rode to the stream of Tamati. Saket saw him approaching and rode out to meet him. Anawrahta called out, "Brother, you the elder strike first." Saket thrust at him with his lance, but Anawrahta parried the blow with the Arindama lance. The weapon did not reach his body but instead pierced the pommel of his saddle. When Saket saw this, he was overcome with fear and began to tremble. Anawrahta then said, "Brother, your turn is over. Now it is mine. Meet it as best you can." He struck him, piercing him through with the Arindama lance so that it entered at the front and came out the back. Saket's horse ran away with him to the river, where he died. This encounter, as described in the Glass Palace Chronicle, feels like a scene from Arthurian legend, filled with chivalric duels, mythical weapons of great power, and a fight to protect a woman's honor. While we would be foolish to accept it at face value as strict history, it provides a vivid sense of the turbulent political landscape of medieval Myanmar. It captures what must have felt like a clash of great heroic forces, the stuff of medieval romances, myth, and poetry. With his brother defeated, Anawrahta took the throne. However, the victory came with a heavy psychological burden. Anawrahta was tormented by guilt over the death of his brother. He tried to ease his conscience by launching massive construction projects, building temples and infrastructure throughout the kingdom. For 6 full months, the king suffered from insomnia, unable to sleep because of the fratricide he had committed. Eventually, the deity Sakra appeared to him in a dream with a solution. The spirit said, "King, if you wish to cleanse the sin you committed against your brother, you must build many pagodas, monasteries, and rest houses, and dedicate the spiritual merit to him. You must also devise many wells, ponds, dams, ditches, fields, and canals, sharing that merit with your brother as well." Archaeological findings confirm that Anawrahta took this message to heart, as he became a truly prolific builder. Shortly after taking the throne in 1044, he marched north to lock down the border. He constructed 43 fortresses along the Irrawaddy River. Since the north was the traditional gateway for invasions into Burma, it is clear he was determined to secure his territory. Anawrahta designed this network of forts as an armored corridor that protected the valuable northern farmlands and allowed his armies to travel rapidly along well-supplied routes. He also fortified many towns in the region with sturdy walls and garrisons. Beyond defense, he built extensive irrigation canals and upgraded existing water systems to maximize the land's agricultural potential. In fact, many of the reservoirs and canals he created are still functioning today, nearly 1,000 years later. With the north fully secured to his satisfaction, King Anawrahta shifted his focus to the south. The coastal region of southern Myanmar was a patchwork of independent city-states. Many of these had grown wealthy by facilitating trade that traveled by sea to the lands of India and China. Because the mountains surrounding Myanmar made overland travel difficult, most goods entering the country had to flow through these port towns. Controlling the best farmland was one thing, but Anawrahta knew that if Bagan kept paying trade tariffs to these wealthy ports, it would never achieve the superpower status he dreamed of. According to historical records, he marched south and besieged the city of Thaton. The Glass Palace Chronicle describes this campaign, though it likely exaggerates the numbers by a factor of 1,000 in its typical style. It claims he gathered all his brave warriors, moving by both land and water. By river, he supposedly sent 800,000 boats and 80 million soldiers. On land, with his 4 generals leading the vanguard and the king in the rear, the force is said to have included 800,000 elephants, 8 million horses, and 18 million troops. The line of soldiers was reportedly so long that the front ranks arrived at the frontier of Thaton before the rear guard had even left the capital. Considering that this force would exceed Myanmar's current population and would have constituted about a quarter of the entire world's population at the time, we can assume this is a myth. However, through this exaggeration, the chronicles prove a point. The army was undeniably impressive. With this massive force, he besieged the city of Thaton, and after holding out for 3 months, the city surrendered. From there, Anawrahta annexed several other coastal cities, transforming his kingdom into a genuine empire. By this time, Bagan had earned the Sanskrit title Irrawaddy, or the city that tramples its enemies. Connecting his capital to these coastal hubs meant Bagan was now linked by sea to the major cultural centers of India, and perhaps most crucially, the island of Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka is a nation located off the coast of southern India, and for much of its history, it has maintained a distinct cultural identity. While Buddhism had largely died out in its homeland of mainland India by this point, it had survived in Sri Lanka. This island nation had become the heartland for an ancient and austere form of the faith, known as Theravada Buddhism. These new links would completely transform the culture and religion of Myanmar, bringing it into contact with fresh spiritual ideas. For King Anawrahta, freshly returned from the southern battlefields, this presented an irresistible opportunity. It was a chance to take on some of his oldest rivals, not an enemy empire, but a powerful institution at the heart of his own kingdom, the Buddhist Church itself. For centuries, the predominant religion in Myanmar had been a strain known as Ari Buddhism. This was a hybrid faith, mixing Tibetan Buddhism with traditional Burmese beliefs. Consequently, their practices were very different from the Buddhist monks we might picture today. Unlike most other sects, the Ari monks wore beards and kept their hair long. They dressed in blue-black robes dyed with indigo, they drank alcohol, and they practiced a form of martial arts similar to boxing. They rode horses. Knowledge grows when it is shared. If you know a fellow seeker, or just someone who needs a peaceful escape into the past, feel free to share this video with them. In fact, they even went so far as to occasionally participate in warfare. Furthermore, these monks venerated the Naga, a potent snake spirit derived from Hindu mythology, and they erected statues honoring these serpents within their temples. Because the Ari monks had been established in Burma for so long, they wielded massive influence throughout the kingdom of Bagan. They possessed vast tracts of land and hoarded significant amounts of treasure. The Great Chronicle, also known as the Maya Yazawin, even documents a shocking allegation that these monks exercised a form of prima nocta, or the rite of the first night, claiming the virginity of brides before their actual wedding nights. The chronicle describes how everyone, from the royal family, generals, and ministers down to village administrators, was required to send their children to the monks at dusk, just before a marriage could take place. The goal was to offer up the flower of virginity. It was said that the brides were only released at sunrise, at which point they were free to wed. As the king grew older and more righteous, he became deeply distressed to witness such immoral customs. It is difficult to determine if these scandalous accusations were factual, or if they were merely royal propaganda invented later to tarnish the monks' reputation. However, one fact remains indisputable. The Ari order held immense power. King Anawrahta had harbored a long-standing desire to dismantle their institution and reshape the religious landscape into something the monarchy could control more effectively. Anawrahta finally found the perfect chance to act when he encountered a visiting sage known as Shin Arahan. Coming from southern Myanmar, a region the king had recently annexed, Shin Arahan had experience traveling through Sri Lanka. He introduced Anawrahta to the benefits of a specific Buddhist denomination found there, one that purported to adhere most strictly to the Buddha's original lessons. This was Theravada Buddhism. which had been nurtured in the great Sri Lankan cities of Polonnaruwa and Anuradhapura. Unlike the Ari, this strain of the faith emphasized a disciplined, simple existence for priests. They were expected to live on alms, abstain from food after noon, avoid all intoxicants, and completely reject the handling of money. Given how unruly and powerful the local Ari monks were, this strict approach must have sounded like the ideal solution to King Anawrahta. The Glass Palace Chronicle depicts the king's conversion as a profound spiritual realization. It describes him being filled with delight and ecstasy as he begged the sage, "My lord, preach to me, even just a little of the law taught by the master." In response, Shin Arahan began teaching him the law, starting with the essential duties that must not be ignored. Then the king's heart was filled with absolute conviction, steady and unshakable. This faith permeated his spirit just as oil saturates cotton that has been teased apart 100 times over. While King Anawrahta may have been sincerely moved by the sage's philosophy, it is undeniable that he also identified a strategic opening. By introducing this specific school of Buddhism to his realm, he could finally break the stranglehold of the Ari monks. Consequently, the king launched a crusade against the established church. He began by dismantling the monks' recruitment pipeline. New decrees were issued stating that commoners were no longer required to hand over their children for monastic service, a practice that had been mandatory. Following this, he revised the penal code to eliminate punishments for those who chose to abandon the priesthood. The result was an exodus, as many disillusioned monks simply hung up their robes to pursue other lives. With every administrative tool available, Anawrahta slowly chipped away at the institution's influence. Naturally, there was resistance. In response, the king banished thousands of defiant monks. Many fled to the volcanic slopes of Mount Popa or disappeared into the dense, forested valleys of the Shan Hills. Although they were never fully eradicated, they would never again command such dominance within the empire. To commemorate his kingdom's conversion, Anawrahta dispatched an envoy to Sri Lanka with a remarkably bold request. He asked for their most sacred artifact, a tooth of the Buddha himself, to be enshrined in one of his grand temples. The Sri Lankans, understandably, declined to send the original. However, at the final moment, they recalled they had a spare, and the envoy returned to Burma with what was presented as a second tooth of the Buddha. Much like the splinters of the true cross that proliferated throughout medieval Europe, Buddha teeth in Southeast Asia had a miraculous tendency to multiply based on the needs of the faithful. For Anawrahta, this was sufficient. When the vessel carrying the relic arrived at the capital, the king waded into the river to personally welcome it. Anawrahta was a highly effective monarch, yet his rule could be rigid and severe. While he frequently accomplished his political goals, it often came at the cost of his public standing. This is most vividly illustrated in the tragic legend involving his son, Kyansitha. Kyansitha was a brilliant military commander who had led his father's forces in numerous campaigns. When residents of the Pegu region appealed for help against raiders who were burning homes and stealing livestock, the king dispatched Kyansitha to resolve the crisis. As the story goes, the prince successfully drove off the bandits, and the grateful people of Pegu sent him back with tribute for the king, including gold, sacred Buddha hairs, and a stunning noblewoman named Yukin, who was intended as a bride for Anawrahta. However, during the return journey, Prince Kyansitha and Yukin fell in love. Upon discovering this betrayal, Anawrahta exiled his own son, forcing him to flee across the Myanmar countryside and live in hiding. This tale of forbidden romance and betrayal has inspired playwrights, poets, and songwriters in Myanmar for centuries. Ultimately, it appears this uncompromising rigidity contributed to King Anawrahta's demise. On April 11, 1077, while riding his elephant on the outskirts of Bagan, the king met his end. The official chronicles claim that a tree spirit, whom the king had previously offended, manifested as a wild buffalo and gored him to death, after which demons vanished with his body. A far more plausible explanation is that the king's lack of popularity finally caught up with him, and he was assassinated by rivals who ensured no evidence of the crime survived. The historical records document his passing with profound grief. Thus this noble king, full of glory, might of arm and dominion, who for full 33 years of royal prosperity had advanced the welfare of the religion, his own welfare, and that of the generations of his sons, grandsons, and great-grandsons, died at the age of 75. Around the time of his death, ominous signs were reported. Bees swarmed the palace throne door, an ogre was heard laughing from the Tharaba gate, the royal sword lost its shine, and a vulture perched upon the palace roof. Following the death of the great Anawrahta, his 26-year-old son, Saulu, ascended to the throne. Despite his age, he would soon earn the moniker Min Lulin, or the Boy King, due to his naive and inexperienced governance. After 5 years of misrule, he faced a rebellion in the south led by the Mon people of the coastal cities his father had previously annexed. Once again, the chronicles present a narrative that sounds almost too strange to be true. In this account, King Saulu lost a dice game to a noble named Yamenkan, a childhood friend. In a fit of sore losing temper, the king dared the noble to rise up against him. One day the king and Yamenkan played at dice, and Yamenkan won, and he rose up and clapped his elbows. Said King Saulu, "You have won a mere game of dice, and you dare to arise and clap your elbows. If you are a man, rebel with Pegu your province." "In truth," asked Yamenkan. "We kings," said the king, "should we utter anything but truth?" According to the text, Yamenkan immediately returned to Pegu and launched the rebellion, just as the king had suggested. While the specific details may be embellished, the story likely captures the essence of King Saulu's character, a man of petty, childish temperament who treated statecraft as a game. Faced with open insurrection, the immature King Saulu was forced to turn to the very man his father had exiled for falling in love with the wrong woman. His half-brother, the folk hero and poet's darling, Khayansitha. Khayansitha emerged from hiding and agreed to command the armies for the childish king against the southern uprising. However, King Saulu proved to be as incompetent on the battlefield as he was in the palace, eventually falling victim to a clever trap. King Saulu and Khayansitha encamped when they reached the island of Paidota, saying, "It is too late today, tomorrow we shall fight." Then in the dim moonlight, Yamenkan came forth and provoked them to do battle. So they followed and fought without heed or observation, and the King Saulu, thinking that an elephant figure sat in the mud was a real elephant, set forth to fight, and the royal elephant he was riding fell into the mud and stuck. King Saulu climbed down from his back and ran, and entering a hole in the banyan tree in the forest, hid there, and his elephant was captured, and the whole army was despoiled and fled. There was none to stop them. Saulu was quickly discovered inside the banyan tree and taken prisoner by the rebel Yamenkan. Another somewhat fantastical section of the chronicles claims Saulu had one final opportunity for freedom when the hero Khayansitha personally infiltrated the enemy camp to extract him. However, Saulu was paranoid that Khayansitha secretly intended to murder him and refused to leave with his rescuer. He convinced himself that Yamenkan, his childhood friend and dice partner, would not harm him, and he stole him from the place where he was kept. Now while Khayansitha bare him on his shoulder, Saulu thought, "Khayansitha is one whom my father has injured, whom I have injured. I fear he steals me away to kill me, but Yamenkan is son of my tutor, surely he will not kill me." Saulu yelled out, "Khayansitha is stealing me." Khayansitha exclaimed, "Then die, you fool! Die the death of a dog at the hands of these scum," flung him down, and ran for his life. Khayansitha swam across the Irrawaddy River and eventually reached safety. Saulu's calculation, like many of his choices, proved fatal. Afraid of further rescue attempts, Yamenkan executed the king in April of 1084. In the high-stakes game of survival, King Saulu seemingly rolled nothing but ones. Following Saulu's execution, Khayansitha continued to lead the royal forces against Yamenkan's rebellion, eventually forcing the rebel leader to flee southward down the river on a luxurious golden barge. Khayansitha dispatched a marksman named Yasin to track him down and eliminate him. The chronicles detail the assassination. Yasin the hunter caught him up below Irrawaddy, and he climbed a fig tree and uttered lovely notes like the voice of a bird. When Yamenkin heard that sound, he opened the door of the golden raft and looked, saying, "What bird is that uttering notes so sweet and wonderful?" Now he had but one good eye, and Yasin the hunter, from the place where he waited peeping, drew his bow and shot and hit the eye of Yamenkin, and he died. With the rebellion crushed, the formerly exiled Kyan Sitha was the sole heir to the throne. He was crowned on April 21, 1084, taking the title Sri Tribhuvanaditya Dhamaraja, translating roughly to Fortunate Buddhist King, Son of the Three Worlds. In many respects, he was the ideal figure to reunify the nation after such a volatile period of division and bloodshed. During his exile, he had spent 7 years living in the southern Mon regions among the coastal cities. There, he had fostered a deep appreciation for Mon culture and people. Upon becoming king, Kyan Sitha welcomed Mon nobles into his court and elevated them to high-ranking positions, including some who had participated in the recent rebellion. This policy of reconciliation ushered in a long era of peace for Myanmar, and with stability came immense prosperity. During this epoch, the capital city of Bagan expanded to a scale and affluence that was previously inconceivable. The population exploded, driven by the agricultural productivity of the region, but Bagan also became a magnet for talent from across the area. Architects, masons, sculptors, artists, monks, and scholars all flocked to the city. We can measure this urban explosion by the sheer volume of temples constructed in the 3 centuries following Anawrahta's reign, all of which can be accurately dated using carbon dating technology. In this period alone, roughly 4,000 temples were erected, supported by thousands of additional brick structures. Many of these religious sites featured massive stupas or domed shrines at their cores, representing a staggering investment of labor and wealth. This construction boom required a veritable army of carpenters, masons, plasterers, and metalworkers who were compensated with cash or through bartered land, livestock, and food. These artisans, in turn, relied on a vast network of supporting industries. Bricklayers needed masons. Masons needed firewood supplied by porters and lumberjacks. Sculptors carving endless Buddha statues required miners to extract marble and dolerite, as well as elephant handlers to move the massive stones. Everyone required sustenance: meat, game, vegetables, fruit, and rice, along with rice wine or the foaming toddy fermented from palm sap. With employment opportunities available in every quarter, people migrated thousands of kilometers to work in the massive construction zone that was Bagan. The Glass Palace Chronicle provides a list of professions found among the people of a conquered city during Anawrahta's time, giving us a glimpse into the diverse livelihoods within Bagan. Thereafter he sent away separately without mixing such men as were skilled in carving, turning, and painting, masons, molders of plaster and flower patterns, blacksmiths, silversmiths, braziers, founders of gongs and cymbals, filigree flower workers, doctors and trainers of elephants and horses, makers of shields round and embossed, men skilled in frying, parching, baking, and frizzling, yakin hairdressers, and men cunning in perfumes, odors, flowers, and the juices of flowers. From its origins as a small fortified settlement, Bagan grew to cover more than 100 square kilometers, an area more than double the size of ancient Rome. Population estimates for this era suggest as many as 400,000 people resided within the city limits. It was during this golden age that many of the most magnificent temples were built, the largest being the Thatpianiu Temple. Consecrated in 1144, its colossal spired pagoda soars to over 61 meters, equivalent to a 20-story building. Nearby stands the Ananda Temple, reaching 51 meters in height. This structure functioned as a place of worship, a library, and a monastery all in one. The first 2 levels housed the monks, the 3rd floor contained sacred images, the 4th preserved books and manuscripts, and the 5th level at the pinnacle held precious relics. Constructing these temples was viewed as the ultimate act of spiritual devotion for a monarch. When a later ruler, King Alungsithu, dedicated the completion of the Shwegaji Pagoda, He recited a prayer that conceptualized the temples as grand spiritual infrastructure, a bridge spanning samsara, the endless cycle of rebirth, leading toward enlightenment. By this abundant merit, I desire here nor hereafter no angelic pomp of Brahmas, Suras, Maras, nor the state and splendors of a monarch, nay, not even to be the pupil of the conqueror. But I would build a causeway sheer across the river of samsara, and all folk would speed across thereby until they reached the blessed city. As the timeline stretches back thousands of years, it is easy to feel small against the vastness of history. If you are enjoying this journey through time so far, comment the word ancient, so I know you're still with me. These temples were held in the highest reverence. One of the inscriptions at the unfinished Mingun Padadoji temple, which was constructed sometime after the fall of Bagan, features a stark contrast. It offers blessings for the reverent alongside terrifying curses for vandals. The inscription asks who will uphold the faith like the donor, wishing that whether they are royal descendants, ministers, or princes, they be granted the wheel of treasure and the glory of King Mandhata. However, the text turns dark for anyone who even spoils a single oil lamp. It wishes upon them the 8 dangers, 10 punishments, 32 karma results, 96 diseases, and sudden, incurable afflictions that 1,000 doctors could not fix. It condemns them to suffer in the 8 major and 12 minor hells, the 40 limbos, and to dwell among demons and ghosts. Even after eons of this, the curse prays they return to earth 5,000 times as boneless worms or water leeches. While royal chronicles obsess over the comings and goings of kings, they unfortunately ignore the commoner, so for that perspective, we must look to poetry. Manuscripts were incredibly expensive. Records from 1273 show a Tripitaka set cost 50 kilos of silver, equivalent to 150 slaves, 5,000 acres of rice paddies, or 4 monasteries. Because of this cost, most people remained illiterate. However, the 15th century poet Shin Maharadathara described the ideal scholar. He wrote that a student must be as eager as an eagle snatching a hen, questioning and discussing rather than just reading palm leaves. They should devour texts with the gusto of a cat enjoying a shrimp and dissect topics fearlessly, like a lion. Food is another topic these poets illuminate. Wanji Padithayaza, writing in the 1600s, details a farmer's menu. The peasant collects crabs, frogs, and snails from his rice fields, tossing them into a basket with various leaves and plants for a curry. At home, the meal is cooked fresh with spices so hot they make the family go THT, THT, THT as they eat together. Visually, temple paintings reveal that wealthy citizens mix Chinese and Indian styles, wearing silk, cotton, bangles, and jeweled belts. Tattoos were also ubiquitous. A 19th-century European visitor noted that every Burmese male was tattooed from waist to knee with arabesques and animals, resembling a pair of breeches. Ultimately, though, the farmers and laborers are forgotten, while only the royal dramas survive in the record. King Khayansitha despaired of having an heir until 1090, when a son was finally born. Overjoyed, he crowned the infant, named Sithu, immediately and served as regent until his own death 22 years later. Sithu ruled well politically but failed as a father. He banished his eldest son, leaving the succession to his second son, Narathu, a man history remembers as a psychopath. When King Sithu reached 101 and fell ill, Narathu moved him to the Shwegu pagoda. Waking up, the old king demanded to know whose trickery this was. Fearing his father's recovery, Narathu smothered the centenarian under a pile of clothes. Narathu then tricked his banished brother into returning to take the throne, only to poison him the night after his coronation. Now ruling alone, Narathu was a terror. The Glass Palace Chronicle claims he was a former mountain demon, ruling with such brutality that his wives and subjects cursed him silently. To atone for his crimes, he began building the massive Damyangi Temple. However, his end came violently. 8 assassins disguised as monks approached him, drew daggers, and stabbed him to death before committing mass suicide. Political chaos eventually settled under King Narapatasithu, but the empire's foundation was rotting. The cause was the very religion that united them. Kings and citizens donated land to the church for spiritual merit, hoping to be reborn wealthy rather than as hungry ghosts. Since religious land was tax-exempt forever, the state's taxable land base shrank. It was an ancient version of modern offshore tax havens. Today, 10% of global wealth is hidden offshore, but in places like Russia or the Gulf states, it can exceed 60%. By the late 1200s, the Bagan Church held 63% of the arable land and most of the gold, effectively serving as a massive tax haven that starved the government. Kings couldn't forcibly seize this land from unarmed monks. Instead, they used sasana, a religious purification process, claiming that excessive wealth violated the monastic code. They would confiscate assets to purify the church. Yet this backfired. A purified church attracted even more donations from pious citizens and new kings. Wealth flowed relentlessly from the crown to the tax-free sector. Historian Michael Onthwin notes that the institutions which built Bagan eventually cannibalized it. By the time of King H. the treasury was empty and temple building ceased. This economic weakness was a remote origin of collapse, making the state vulnerable to immediate shocks. When rebellions flared in 1258, the cash-strapped government struggled to fund the military response. Then came the ultimate shock, the Mongols. Kublai Khan, Genghis Khan's grandson, was sweeping across Asia, establishing the Yuan dynasty in Beijing. While fighting the southern Song dynasty, Kublai realized the Song might escape through Myanmar. To close this backdoor, he turned his attention to Bagan. Kublai sent envoys to Bagan demanding tribute. The Burmese king, Anawrahta, was a gluttonous tyrant known as the Ogre, who allegedly ate 300 curries a day and possessed 3,000 concubines. He was so arrogant that he executed anyone who sneezed in his presence. When the Mongol Taruk envoys arrived in 1271 demanding vassalage and golden vessels, the king was incensed by their lack of manners. Chronicles suggest he ordered the execution of the entire delegation. Kublai Khan, stinging from a failed invasion of Japan where divine winds destroyed his fleet, didn't want a full-scale war. He sent troops to the borderlands. Anawrahta responded by marching an army north to the Vachang Valley. A poet later described the army's bravery and the sound of drums in the forest. Marco Polo, serving Kublai Khan, recorded that the Burmese fielded 2,000 war elephants, each carrying a timber tower with archers, alongside 60,000 troops. They advanced to meet the Mongols, who had never faced elephants before. The Burmese king positioned his troops, assigning men to the elephants and organizing his cavalry and infantry lines. At first, the plan seemed to work perfectly. The Mongol horses were terrified by the sight of the massive elephants. They refused to charge, swerving away in fear every time they were urged toward the enemy line. Meanwhile, the Burmese king continued to press the attack with his elephants and soldiers. However, the Mongols were seasoned veterans of the open Central Asian steppes. They knew that if an opponent was too powerful to engage head-on, the best tactic was to retreat and rain arrows upon them from a distance. The Mongol commander, acting with the cool head of an experienced leader, ordered his troops to do exactly that. They pulled back and unleashed a relentless barrage of arrows, specifically targeting the advancing elephants. The shafts fell like rain, inflicting heavy casualties on both the beasts and their riders. The elephants, maddened by the pain of the arrows, refused to advance any further. Instead, they panicked and stampeded backward into the forest, smashing the wooden castles on their backs against tree branches and tearing their harnesses to pieces in their frenzy. With the Burmese lines in total chaos, the Mongol cavalry finally charged, shattering the Bagan army. The Mongol historical records can barely hide their pride regarding this engagement. They boast that a mere 700 Mongol troopers routed a Burmese force of 50,000, while suffering only a single fatality on their side. While that figure is almost certainly a massive exaggeration, the defeat was absolute. Interestingly, the Burmese chronicles simply pretend this disastrous battle never happened. The primary defense of Bagan had been crushed on its own territory, leaving the path to the fertile Irrawaddy Valley wide open. The invaders wasted no time capitalizing on the breakthrough. The very next fortress, Kongsin, capitulated just 6 days later on December 9, 1283, allowing the Mongols to pour into the river valley. The Burmese chronicles describe the threat in hyperbolic terms, claiming the Turks arrived with an impossible force of 6 million cavalry and 20 million infantry. Facing this bleak reality, King Narathihapat dispatched 2 of his generals to make a stand at Ngasingjian, a vital river crossing near Bamo. They fortified the town heavily with moats and earthworks, holding the line for 3 full months. They fought fiercely, sparing no one, not even the enemy's animal handlers. However, the Mongol numbers were overwhelming. According to the records, when 10,000 attackers were killed, the Mongols sent 20,000 more. When those fell, 40,000 took their place. Eventually, the defenders were exhausted, and once the Mongols crossed the river, the fortress was lost. When news of this defeat reached the capital, the king's courage completely evaporated. He decided to abandon Bagan and flee south. He justified this retreat to his ministers by claiming the city was too small and shallow to properly house his massive army of men and elephants, suggesting they establish a new stronghold in the southern territories. Because of this shameful flight, history remembers him by the name Tarakpai Min, or the king who fled from the Turks. His departure left the nation leaderless and in a state of anarchy. Seeing that the king could no longer protect them, many provinces simply declared independence and looked to their own survival. For the next year, the king tried to negotiate with the invaders while the lowlands were torn apart by constant skirmishes. It remains a subject of debate whether the Mongol army actually entered the city of Bagan itself. Burmese texts assert that the generals sent to defend the north managed to halt the invasion about 160 kilometers from the capital. It is quite plausible that the extreme heat of the dry zone and tropical diseases like malaria sapped the momentum of the Mongol advance. Archaeological evidence supports this theory, as the temples of Bagan show very few signs of war damage or fire. However, Marco Polo, writing from the court of Kublai Khan, tells a different story. He claims the Mongols did conquer the city, but chose to leave the architecture untouched out of respect. He describes them finding towers of gold and silver and asking the great Khan what should be done with them. Kublai Khan supposedly ordered that since the king had built them for the sanctity of his soul, they should remain unharmed, noting that the Tartars had a superstitious rule against disturbing the property of the dead. Regardless of whether they sacked the city or not, the Mongols had no desire for a prolonged occupation. By 1287, a peace treaty was established. The Burmese formally accepted Mongol authority and agreed to pay a heavy annual tribute based on the country's agricultural production. However, this peace was short-lived. In late June, the humiliated King Narathihapat began his journey back up the river from the south, intending to resume his throne as a puppet ruler in the capital he had abandoned. He never made it home. On July 1, 1287, near the port of Prame, his journey was interrupted by his second son, Thihathu. Thihathu stopped the royal barge and surrounded it with 3,000 soldiers with drawn swords. He then presented his father with poisoned food, urging him to eat. The king knew exactly what was happening. He refused to eat at first, but seeing he was trapped, he performed a solemn ritual. He removed a ring from his finger, poured 4 drops of water over it to seal a vow, and prayed that in all his future lives wandering through the cycle of rebirth until nirvana, he would never again be cursed with a son. He then ate the poisoned food and died instantly. The assassination of the king was the final death blow for the crumbling empire. The remaining provinces that had stayed loyal now broke away. For 2 years, there was no king at all. When one of Narathihapat's sons, Kyoswa, finally claimed the throne, he ruled over nothing but the ruined city of Bagan itself, possessing no army to enforce his will. He, too, was assassinated along with his heir on May 10, 1299. It was during this period of decline that Marco Polo visited Bagan, witnessing the magnificent temples that were now shadows of their former glory. Throughout this time, the Mongols could have easily occupied the region, but they seemed uninterested. They sent no further expeditions to restore order, preferring to watch from a distance as the power that had once challenged them fragmented and faded into irrelevance. A later inscription by a 14th century king named Minji Swasok summarizes the era with a tragic note. The Burmese Empire disintegrated because of internal strife. The collapse was complete. The area around Bagan remained populated for the next century, with farmers tending their crops and livestock among the crumbling stupas, but the political power was gone. Over time, new kingdoms would rise in the region, some even crowning their kings at Bagan to claim a piece of its legendary past. They might have adopted the grandiose titles of the ancient emperors, but the city itself never reclaimed its former prestige. A handful of impressive religious structures continued to rise until the middle of the 15th century, but eventually, construction slowed to a mere trickle before ceasing altogether, and piece by piece, the great metropolis surrendered to ruin. Despite its decline, the site remained a destination for pilgrims right up to the modern era. Even as local farmers grazed their cattle on the grass sprouting between ancient bricks, travelers journeyed hundreds of miles to witness the unique landscape, hoping to catch the breathtaking glimpse of golden spires and domes piercing the morning mist above the flat valley floor. While several of the massive, more spectacular temples received maintenance and repairs over the following centuries, thousands of smaller, obscure shrines were left to rot, with many vanishing completely as they collapsed into mounds of rubble to be consumed by the encroaching forest. In 1923, the British author William Somerset Maugham journeyed through Thailand and Burma, later capturing his experiences in a travel memoir titled A Gentleman in the Parlor. Within those pages, he describes the profound impact of seeing ruined capitals such as Ayutthaya, Angkor, and Bagan. He notes that in these eastern lands, cities rise to greatness only to be obliterated in a way that instills a sense of unease in Western visitors, who are accustomed to centuries of comparative stability. Maugham observes that scattered throughout the jungle, miles from any settlement, one encounters shattered temples strangled by trees, where smashed idols and intricate carvings amidst the damp vegetation serve as the sole evidence that a bustling metropolis once existed. You stumble upon destitute hamlets which are the only remnants of a wealthy, dominant empire's capital, serving as a bleak reminder of how changeable human achievements truly are. Seeing these collapsed structures suggested to Maugham that his own empire, the one he lived at the heart of, might one day also be consigned to the history books. The author provides a vivid account of his initial arrival at the ruins, approaching via steamboat down the mighty Irrawaddy River. He describes arriving under a dark sky heavy with clouds and light rain. Far off, he spotted the famous pagodas, which appeared massive, distant, and enigmatic rising from the morning mist, resembling the hazy memories of a surreal dream. Maugham admits he couldn't count the sheer number of structures. From a high vantage point, they encircle the viewer as far as vision extends, scattered about as densely as grave markers in a churchyard. These monuments vary wildly in size and condition, yet their grandeur is made even more impressive by the environment, as they are the sole survivors proving a heavily populated city once thrived there. At the time of his visit, only a sprawling village remained, featuring wide, untidy roads bordered by large trees, a pleasant enough spot. In the days that followed, Maugham wandered through the decaying pagodas and temples, walking amidst the dilapidated buildings, feeling that the entire area was soaked in a peculiar, enduring sadness. Inside the shrines, meditating Buddha statues remain seated, though the gold leaf has long since vanished from the giant forms and the figures are crumbling back into dust. The mythical lions standing sentry at the gates are rotting on their pedestals, marking a strange and melancholy location. Weeds sprout from cracks in the floor, while saplings anchor themselves in crevices, becoming sanctuaries for birds. Hawks circle the peaks while small green parrots chatter in the eaves. The canopy was loud with birdsong, accompanied by chirping crickets and the repetitive croaking of frogs, while somewhere nearby, a young boy whistled a sad melody. To truly understand the spirit of this era, we look to the work of Anawrahta, a renowned poet of the Bagan period. This scholar acted as the chief minister for King Narrathienka, who held the throne during the late 12th century. Following a palace coup, the monarch's brother usurped power and started eliminating government officials who had remained loyal to his predecessor. Consequently, Anantassaria was condemned to death, and much like Marco Polo would do in a Genoa prison cell on the opposite side of the globe a century later, the minister spent his final confinement writing. As he awaited execution, he composed a poem that history remembers as one of the finest literary works created during the artistic bloom of the Bagan Empire. His verses explore themes of forgiveness and loss, focusing on the acceptance that everything must eventually fade into dust and darkness. As you hear his words, picture walking through the deserted avenues of Bagan as the temples decayed and vegetation overtook the homes and roads. Visualize trees bursting through the brickwork of stupas and shadowed entrances, with wild animals roaming the streets as the sun dips into a red haze behind the hills, while poets chant about the end of the world. He wrote that often, when one man prospers, another must suffer destruction. Such is simply the nature of things. The satisfaction of a courtier enjoying royal confidences in golden palaces and a king's own good fortune are merely bubbles on the surface of a vast ocean, momentary and fleeting. He reasoned that even if mercy and pity dictated his release from execution, he would still not escape death, for he was inseparable from karma. It is the nature of every living thing to decay. He vowed that should he meet his lord the king again in a future rebirth within the cycle of samsara, he would bear no grudge but would lovingly forgive him, for his body of blood was impermanent. Danger and death are constant enemies, and in this world they will always remain. As we close the book on this era, please leave a like if this story helped you relax or learn something new. Comment which historical mystery you want me to open up in the next video, and subscribe to the channel to ensure you never miss a night in the archives.